These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? As usual, one can work through this problem with a search for patterns, with a look at your forcing moves, or, most plausibly, with some combination of those approaches. Thus you might start by toying with possible knight forks, or near forks. Knight takes bishop attacks black's queen. Is there a way to drag black's king into a position that can be forked from there? There is. You can play a sequence of attacks on f8 that leave the black king standing there at the end. See if you can work it out, the details are below. Or now consider how the position comes apart as you inspect your forcing moves. Two natural ones to consider might be knight takes at b7, picking up a pawn, or queen moves to f7, check. Safely giving check and perhaps starting to hunt the king. But white can do better, and you will see this only by considering less obvious checks and their consequences. In addition to queen moves to f7, check. White also has queen moves to f8, check. This loses the queen, as black is required to answer with rook takes queen, but rather than abandon the idea, follow it through, then what check can white play? The obvious follow-up is rook takes rook, check. Exhausting the battery on the f-file, and again the response is forced, king takes rook. The result of the sequence will have been the loss of white's queen and rook in return for black's rook, but also and most importantly the movement of black's king to f8. Black's king and queen would then be on dark squares. Knight takes bishop, check. Forks them, and after winning the queen white has gained a piece, the bishop captured by the knight. White to move. What is the best move? Start by finding every check white can give. There are 4, queen takes at e6, queen takes bishop, knight moves to f6, and knight moves to e7. The first 2 lose the queen and have no good follow ups, but knight moves to f6, check. Is interesting, black can't respond with bishop takes knight because his bishop is pinned by white's queen. So black must move his king. Now ask if white will have another check after the king moves. Notice that whether the king goes to h8 or f7, white can play queen takes bishop, check. Either way black has the reply king takes queen. So then his king will be where his bishop now sits, on g7 at last on a dark square, and your knight will be on f6. Since your only plausible attacking piece is your knight, you naturally are on the lookout for a fork. In the resulting position you find it at e8. After taking black's queen, you're up a bishop. White to move. What is the best move? Your only piece that can do any checking is the queen, at g7 and g8. There is no apparent follow-up if it goes to g8 and is taken by black's king. But now suppose white plays queen moves to g7 and look at the resulting position. Notice the significance of the pawn at f6, it means black would have no choice but to play queen takes queen. You still are thinking in checks, so look for the next one and arrive at the natural recapture pawn from f6 takes queen, check. Again black then has only one legal move, king moves to g8. Continue to be relentless in looking for the next check and you come to knight moves to e7, check. A fork of black's king and c8 rook. White nets a rook with the sequence. White to move. What is the best move? Start by examining every check. Again, it's drill. There are three: knight takes at a7, or a move of either knight to d6. Knight takes at a7 loses the knight to knight takes knight without a good follow-up. Moving either knight to d6 results in bishop takes knight, but white then can recapture with another check, knight takes bishop, check. With his ability to capture on d6 now exhausted, black would have to move his king out of check to b8 or c7. Then what? You could look for yet another check using white's bishop, with inconclusive results. Or you could notice that white's remaining knight then would be on a dark square and that black's rooks both would be on dark squares, too. Knight moves to f7 forks them and wins the exchange. This time the point of the checks wasn't to move the black king into position to be forked. It was to keep black busy with threats he had to address while you prepared to fork his rooks. White to move. What is the best move? You might start by seeing that white has an almost fork with knight moves to e6. To make it work, he would need to nudge black's king over to g7. Now play with your forcing moves. You might start by examining every check. The queen has several queen takes at h6, queen moves to h8, queen moves to g8, queen moves to g7, queen moves to f7, and queen moves to e7. All of them lose the queen and thus fail to create a profitable fork even in cases where the king does go to g7. But there is one more check, bishop takes at g6. How would black respond? With king takes bishop. Still no fork would be possible, but once the king moves you naturally reconsider the checks you can give and their consequences. As you do it, bear in mind that the knight on d4 already can attack black's queen from e6, and so will have a fork if the king can be forced onto g5 or g7. This is an example of working back and forth between ideas based on pattern recognition and experiments with checks. The interesting new check white has is queen moves to f5, interesting because the queen attacks the king and is protected by the knight. Black's only legal reply is king moves to g7. Again, with a move by the king you re-evaluate your tactical options. Now the king and queen sit on forkable squares, knight moves to e6, check. Forks and wins the queen. This position is a bit tricky because it takes a moment to see that white's key move, 2. Queen moves to f5, forces black's king to g7. Learning to see where the king can and can't go when it's checked takes a little practice. White to move. What is the best move? White has 3 checks to analyze: queen moves to e7, queen moves to f8, and bishop takes at e6. The 2 queen checks, in response to either of which black plays king takes queen, almost create opportunities for white's knight to fork the king and queen, but not quite. The forking square, e6, is protected in either case. So consider bishop takes at e6, check. Black's likely reply is bishop takes bishop. We will consider an alternative in a moment. Now ask what checks you then would have, and you are returned to the same 2 queen checks mentioned a moment ago. Queen moves to f8, check. Requires king takes queen. Notice that the king can't move to g6, leaving the black king and queen on dark squares along with white's knight. The forking square, e6, no longer is protected by the bishop. Now the bishop is on e6. So 1. Knight takes bishop, check. Works for white, netting a pawn. Notice the repeating pattern in the thought process involved: find a check, consider the response, look for another check, all the while keeping the changes occurring on the board clear in your mind's eye and watching out for forks. After white's initial bishop takes at e6, black has another option: king moves to e8. But now he immediately loses another pawn to knight takes at d5, with more complications to follow, so bishop takes bishop is less costly. White to move. What is the best move? Actually this one doesn't involve two checks, but it fits here because it does involve the search for a check after another forcing move. The trouble from the outset is that neither of white's available checks are productive. Bishop moves to e6, check. Loses the bishop, queen takes at d5, check. Loses the queen. Still, white sees that his knight is close to being able to deliver a game-ending fork at f7, there it attacks the queen and would attack the king if it could be driven into the corner at h8. Since checks don't seem helpful in producing this result, white considers the next prominent way of forcing changes on the board, captures. The most prominent piece for a piece capturing possibility is bishop takes knight, which leads to pawn from h7 takes bishop. The important question about such an exchange, of course, is what does it leave behind? What open lines? It opens the h-file, so ask anew what checks are possible and with what consequences. There is a fresh one, rook moves to h8, check. Black has to play king takes rook in reply. White's knight guards the king's flight square at f7, the check at h8 sucks the king onto that same square. So now the king has moved, and whenever that happens you ask what checks have become available, especially given that the knight has been waiting to administer a fork at f7. Indeed, knight moves to f7, check. Is white's only check then remaining? It wins the queen. Black moves his king, and white plays knight takes queen. Now black recaptures bishop takes knight, and if the black move of his king was to g8, then white now has the queen fork queen takes at d5, check. What all this means is that the original bishop takes knight wins a piece, as black cannot afford to recapture pawn from h7 takes bishop. As we have seen, that often is the significance of seeing a fork, not that you get to play it, but that you are able to make material gains because you realize, and your opponent realizes, that if your captures are avenged by your opponent he ends up the victim of an even worse double attack. Incidentally, it might have occurred to you that black could reply to white's one. Bishop takes knight with 1. Queen takes bishop, but this is worse. The problem for black is that white then plays 2. Queen takes at d5, check. Again, always looking for the next check, and now has tremendous pressure against the black king's position. The pressure may not result in immediate mate, but it produces heavy casualties. If black moves his king to h8, white has 3. Rook takes at h7, check. Which requires the black queen to take the rook on h7, the king can't move, and then the queen gets taken by white's knight, for knight takes queen. If black recaptures king takes knight on h7, white has a queen fork, 5 queen moves to h5, check, which wins the rook on e8 and leads to mate soon after. This last kicker might be hard for you to spot, because you have to see that by the 5th move the white queen would have clear paths from d5 to h5 and from h5 to the rook on e8. But just seeing that black loses his queen is enough for now. White also can do at least as well, maybe better, by playing 3. Knight takes at h7, but let that pass for now, it's more complicated. If black instead replies to queen takes at d5, check. By moving his king to f8, white has knight takes at h7, check. And black again must sacrifice his queen with queen takes knight to put out the fire. If black instead replies to knight takes at h7, check. By moving his king over to e7, white plays bishop takes bishop c5 plus, now black's only legal option is to interpose his queen on d6, losing it next move and getting mated soon after. There are some other possibilities, but white does pretty well in all of them. White also does nicely by starting with queen moves to f3, but that's a tale for another time. Some of those variations sketched a moment ago take a little time to see. The trick to them is to think relentlessly about what checks white might play in response to each of black's moves. Black to move. What is the best move? Using mate threats to force pieces into position. Now we're going to consider a few positions where the elements of a fork are brought into being by a judicious use of mating threats. These studies will be pretty hard, at least by comparison to those we've seen already. Peruse them for the ideas involved. The whole question of the tactical use of mating threats will be explored in more detail, and in a more step-by-step fashion, in the next chapter, on queen forks. Prospects for a knight fork for black might seem remote in the position to the left, but it turns out to be easily accomplished. Begin by thinking about the enemy king and any pressure you can put on it. Knight moves to g4 is interesting because it seals off f2 and, more to the point, h2, leaving the white king trapped on the back rank just as it would be if there were a wall of pawns in front of it. You look for the follow-up and see that black would then be ready to mate with rook moves to a1, check. White would have the useless interposition rook moves to d1, to which black replies rook takes rook, checkmate. Now of course after black plays knight moves to g4, white has a move he can use to fend off the coming rook moves to a1, check. He plays rook moves to d1, thus preparing to meet rook moves to a1 with rook takes rook. What now for black? Anytime your knight is in the picture and enemy pieces have moved, consider forking possibilities. From g4 the knight would be able to jump to f2 with check and take the rook for free next move. The trick to the position is to carefully look not only for any checks but also for any mating threats you can create, not necessarily because you expect them to lead to mate, but because you know they can create pressures that have tactical payoffs. A search for mating threats includes consideration of any move like knight moves to g4 that, while not giving check, traps the enemy king in a tight space. Then you figure out what your opponent would have to do to defuse the threat, and ask whether any forks or other tactical moves would be possible on the board as it then would look. Black to move. What is the best move? This position closely resembles the last one, but here each side has an extra piece, and the one that matters is white's bishop on c7. Now if black tries the same beginning move discussed in the prior position, knight moves to g4, white has a better way than rook moves to d1 to fend off the threat of rook moves to a1, checkmate. He can instead play bishop moves to b6, preparing to meet black's rook moves to a1 with bishop moves to g1, which would effectively block the check. So black needs another idea. The natural alternative to explore is an immediate one. Rook moves to a1, check. Forcing white's king to h2. Black then looks for his next check and finds 2. Knight moves to g4, check. Forcing the king up another square to h3. Now watch this, black plays 3. Knight moves to e3, not a check, but renewing the threat of mate via rook moves to h1, since the knight now seals off g4 and keeps the white king trapped on the h-file. White somehow has to find an out for his king. Moving it to h4 won't do, that still leaves no safe square after black plays rook moves to h1. But white has two other choices. A. The first is king moves to h2, readying the king to capture the rook if it moves to h1. But keep track of the black knight's position, it has moved twice and is on e3, a dark square. If white does move his king to h2, another dark square, black can skip rook moves to h1, instead he wins a rook with the knight fork. Knight moves to f1, check. B. White's other option in reply to 3. Knight moves to e3 is to step his g3 pawn forward to g4, giving the king a flight square to the side. Now black plays 4. Rook moves to h1 and white has 5. King moves to g3. Again, though, this puts white's king onto a dark square and allows black to win the rook with the knight fork. Knight moves to f1, check. This whole sequence also was available in the previous position. If you saw it there, great. The point is that here you would have to use it. The shorter fork described in the previous frame no longer works. In a sense, though, the lesson of this position is the same as in the prior one. Think about checks and mate threats you can create, not just on the board in front of you but also on the board as it will look after a check or two or after some other set of forcing moves. Here this means seeing 3. Knight moves to e3, which doesn't give check but does threaten mate and so forces white to choose between two moves that each lead him into a fork. When your knight is hopping around as black's does here, you especially want to think about forking possibilities at every turn. 3. Knight moves to e3 not only creates a mate threat but also puts the knight on a dark square along with white's rook, meaning that black can fork the rook if white's king steps onto one of its available dark squares as well as it soon must. White to move. What is the best move? White has limited resources, but one of them is a knight on e5 that can give check with knight takes at f3 or knight takes at g4. Those checks are of no use now, but they're important to see because they mean the knight is poised to deliver a fork if one of black's pieces can be lured onto another square that the knight is able to reach from f3 or g4. Another way to put the point is that any other squares the knight can reach from f3 or g4 may now be very safe for white to occupy with one of his other pieces. He would be happy to see black perform a capture there and walk into a fork. Since white only has one other piece, a rook, the natural thing is to experiment with places it can go that take advantage of this forking potential. There is one such square, f6. If black replies to 1. Rook moves to f6 with queen takes rook, he gets forked with knight takes at g4 and loses his queen. Well, so what if black doesn't play queen takes rook? The first way to explore that question is by asking what checks you next would have and seeing rook moves to h6, which turns out to be mate. Notice how constrained black's king is. So actually black does have to play 1. Queen takes rook to avoid the mate threat, and this results in the aforementioned knight fork. Once you understand white's mating idea here, it might occur to you to start instead with 1. Rook takes at g5. This, too, puts white one move away from mate on the h-file, with rook moves to h5. When you look for ways black could fend off the mate, you see queen moves to h6 and realize that this would arrange black's king and queen to be forked with knight takes at g4, check. Indeed, this achieves the knight fork without giving up a rook at the beginning, so at first blush it looks better than the brazen rook moves to f6. But there is a catch. Are you sure black would walk into the fork by replying to rook takes at g5 with queen moves to h6? Rook takes at g5 is a formidable threat, but it isn't a check, so black has some freedom in replying to it. Consider not only queen moves to e8 but the possibility that black can go on the offensive with queen moves to b6, check. White is pretty much forced to play his king to e1, king moves to f1 results in queen moves to g1, checkmate. And then black holds the initiative with another check, queen moves to e3, check. And notice that this is a queen fork of the rook now on g5, which white is about to lose. And then white has to worry about the black f-pawn promoting, and will have to sacrifice his knight to stop it. Starting with rook moves to f6 avoids the mess just described because it puts the rook on the 6th rank, allowing it to reply to 1. Black queen moves to b6 with 2. Rook takes queen. So the short of it is that starting with rook moves to f6 wins the game for white, rook takes at g5, which looks safer, loses it. To reiterate the crucial train of thought, you might overlook the resource black has in 1. Black queen moves to b6 by focusing too much on how he can defend against mate, since from that perspective queen moves to h6 does seem to be his only move. The key, again, is to ask not just about defense but about what counter threats black might try, and especially what checks he can give. Queen moves to b6, and then what further checks, queen moves to e3 or queen moves to g1. That's the biggest difference between working with checks and working with mate threats. They both force your opponent's replies to some extent, but the mate threat gives him the option of seizing the initiative if he can find a way to do it, so you must ask if he can. Going back to the original idea, of course you might have seen it not only by thinking about your knight check but also by starting with the stuckness of black's king. It has no safe escape from the h-file. This makes you think of putting a rook onto the h-file, but it's hard to get it there because black has a queen position to defend against any such effort. Yet for the sake of argument you go ahead and imagine 1. Rook moves to f6, queen takes rook and then see that this puts black's king and queen both on dark squares, enabling them to be forked with knight takes at g4, check. White to move. What is the best move? Strategic implications. Your first question before making almost any move is whether there is a tactical opportunity for you on the board. If there isn't, as routinely will be true, then your choice of move will be determined by strategic considerations, attempts to secure positional advantages that may ripen into tactical opportunities. One goal of strategic play is to create the types of positions where tactics, such as the double attacks we have studied, become possible. It is not the purpose of this site to advise you on effective strategy in any depth, but here are a few elementary points on the subject, particularly as it relates to the knight. A couple of general things first. It often has been observed that good positional play leads naturally, perhaps even mysteriously, to chances for tactical wizardry. Why? The reasons have to do with what good positional play accomplishes. The most important purpose of it is to expand the power and mobility of your pieces, often the same thing, because the power of a piece largely is a function of how many squares it attacks, which in turn will depend on its mobility. A rook on an open file, i.e., a file containing no pawns, is very mobile and for that reason very powerful. Likewise a bishop on an open diagonal. So when you look at a piece and assess the quality of its position, consider how many squares it controls. A fully deployed army of pieces will attack a large share of the squares on the board, especially including squares in your opponent's half of the board, many of them 2 or 3 times. A second purpose of positional play, of course, is the converse, limiting the power and mobility of your opponent's pieces. The fewer the squares he attacks, the greater your ability to put your own pieces there. These principles relate to tactics in obvious ways. If your pieces have lots of room to move and attack lots of squares, that means they can range more boldly into parts of the board where they might cause trouble to your opponent. It also means you are more likely to be able to coordinate them, bringing 2 or 3 or 4 pieces to bear on a sector in ways that permit a combination, perhaps sacrificing one, pinning with the other, and then capturing or forking with the third. Note that an individual piece does not threaten much when it ranges into enemy territory by itself. As we have seen many times, a knight usually needs help from other pieces to set up a good fork. Meanwhile, if your opponent's pieces are constricted or blocked in their movements, this does more than prevent them from causing you trouble. It makes them prey to tactical strikes, because they give your opponent fewer good options in responding to checks, captures, and threats that you make. So when you aren't playing tactics, think about these two considerations: how you can place your pieces to enlarge the amount of territory, space, they attack and control, and how you can place your pieces and pawns to confine your opponent's army. This partly is a matter of simple gestures like moving your rooks onto open files, getting your knights and bishops off the back rank and out where they can exert pressure down the board, and keeping a pawn or two in the center so that your opponent can't plant pieces there and so that your pieces there are protected. It's also a matter of subtler things, exchanging pawns where the exchange will create an open or half-open file for your rook, but perhaps not if it creates such files for his rook, placing your pawns, and keeping his pawns, on squares that block the paths of his bishops, and thinking about how pawn moves and exchanges affect the lines open to other pieces on both sides. These are general ideas to consider when you are picking a move without any immediate tactical purpose. Against this backdrop, consider the knight in particular. The knight doesn't need open lines because it jumps rather than slides. But it still needs help from your pawns to be effective. The first thing to grasp is that the knight's prospects for creating mischief tend to increase as it moves up the board. A white knight on f3 early in the game serves mostly a defensive purpose, and a valuable one, though of course even this knight has offensive potential, as we occasionally have seen. The same knight on, say, d4, d5, or d6 becomes a terrible offensive threat. On d6 it strikes out at 8 squares, including 6 in your opponent's half of the board. From any of the squares just listed, the knight can attack the opponent's back rank, and often his king, in one move. More than 90% of the knight forks we have considered involved the king as one of the two targets. So an important general strategic aim is to get one of your knights planted on a square on your 4th rank or beyond. An especially good place to plant a knight is on a square near the center, since from there it can make threats and influence play in all sectors of the board. This is why chess books often speak of the importance of controlling the center, and of the battles that players wage to keep a pawn on the central squares and to keep enemy pawns away from there. The point is not necessarily that pawns in the center themselves threaten anything, it is that the pawns control the squares that they can attack. When you have a pawn on e4, it controls not e4 but d5 and f5. Enemy pieces are unable to move to those squares, your pieces can. Having good central squares on which you can plant your pieces is important. That is where they are most powerful. The key word is plant. It's not much use to move your knight to a central square only to have it chased away by a pawn. You have to create a hospitable square, an outpost square for your knight. A good outpost, d5 in the diagram on the left, is a square where the knight cannot be harassed by pawns, because the enemy pawns on either side of its file are gone, are blocked, or have advanced up to your knight's rank or beyond it. Ideally, the well-posted knight also is protected by one of your own pawns, that will prevent it from being chased away by one of your opponent's rooks or his queen. The remaining point is to make sure the knight is not threatened by one of your opponent's bishops or knights. The white knight in the diagram to the left has all of the good properties just described. It is planted in the center of the board on d5, where it has two ways to check the black king. So long as the knight stays where it is, it will be a constant forking threat, exerting a great influence over everything else that happens in the game. Notice the role of the pawns here. White controls the knight's square with the pawn on e4, black has no pawn that can chase the knight away and also no knight, and no light squared bishop. As a result, the knight probably will be impossible for black to dislodge without a sacrifice. White had to fight to create this position. For an account of the battle, see Weeramantri's first-rate book Best Lessons of a Chess Coach. The conditions of a good outpost square may seem numerous, but creating them is a suitable task to keep you busy when you aren't playing a tactic. Some of them might take care of themselves, others require work. Realize, first, that every time you move a pawn forward you weaken the squares it used to protect. If the pawns on either side of a square have moved forward or are off the board, the square becomes a hole where the other player eventually can put his pieces, comfortable in the knowledge that no pawn will be able to chase them away. It is common for such holes to be created inadvertently as each side advances and exchanges pawns. In the diagram here, black allowed a hole to be created on d5 by moving his e-pawn to e5 and by allowing his c-pawn to be removed. This is a critical consideration to bear in mind both offensively and defensively. From an offensive standpoint, realize that the most important consequence of an exchange of pawns, or of any sequence, sometimes can be to foul up your opponent's pawn structure and leave holes behind. On the defensive side, think carefully about whether your pawn moves or exchanges will result in holes that create outpost squares for your opponent's knights and other pieces. Place your pawns so that they guard, rather than occupy, the attractive squares where his knights might like to perch. A few pawns well placed in this way can neutralize a knight quite thoroughly. As for your opponent's bishops, if one of them is off the board, then squares of the color the missing bishop used to patrol are natural candidates for outposts. Likewise, if you see a promising outpost square it is worth hunting down and exchanging away the enemy bishop that travels on squares of that color. If you then have to move a knight 3 times to get it onto a good outpost square, it may well be worth it. A knight often will not be a big factor in a game and will not be able to make the types of moves seen in this chapter unless it finds a suitable outpost. Once it does find an outpost, it may dominate the rest of the action. Even if you cannot satisfy all of these criteria for an optimal outpost square, taking care of one or two of them creating the characteristic pawn structure in particular may create an outpost that is suitable for quite a while. If you can't get rid of the bishop on the color of the outpost square, for example, it may nevertheless be out of position to do anything about your knight. And naturally a safe outpost may be easier to create later in the game when there are fewer enemy pieces on the board. What questions should a chess player ask himself or herself? The natural tendency of the mind when looking at a chessboard, as elsewhere, is to jabber away with tangled thoughts. Effective chess requires a different style of thinking, systematic, thorough, and aggressive. You want to ask the right questions before you decide what to do. There are, first, general questions that must be considered routinely. As the great Australian chess writer Cecil Purdy suggested, the most basic are what does he threaten, and what is his reply if I make this move. Also, and relatedly, if I do this, will I leave anything unprotected, and does he have any checks that can cause me trouble? There is no need to blunder away a piece by leaving it unguarded if you are careful to interrogate the board this way as a matter of course. The principles laid out in this chapter might likewise be summarized into a sort of checklist. The goal of studying patterns is to internalize all this and think with your eyes, rather than in a verbal flow chart, but as you are getting started it helps to dwell on the questions that are helpful to ask yourself, with or without words, before deciding what move to make. With respect to knight forks, the important questions generally arise when you have a knight in the same vicinity as some of your opponent's pieces, and especially within striking range of his king. Again, the order in which the questions are asked is not particularly important, and will depend on the salient features of the position that suggest themselves to your eye. Nevertheless, the ones most often important are these: do I have a potential fork? If so, is the square that I need protected? If so, is the protecting piece constrained? Is it pinned, can it be pinned, or would it be pinned after the sequence of moves I am considering? Can the protecting piece be captured, and then be replaced with a piece that is less effective? Can I capture something that the protecting piece guards, thus luring it away from the forking square? If there is no immediate way to do this, are there any sequences of exchanges that would have this effect? Can one of the pieces in the fork be captured and thus exchanged for a more suitable target? If I go ahead and deliver the fork and let my knight be captured, what then becomes possible? What lines are opened, and what pins created? What checks could I then administer, and with what replies? Then what checks or forks would I have? If I don't have a potential fork, can my knight check the king? If so, can a valuable enemy piece be moved onto a square that would be forked by my check? If my knight can't give check, what checks with other pieces now are available to me? What are the responses required by each of them? What checks could I then add, and with what responses? Do the positions resulting from any of these sequences create chances for knight forks? Let this chapter change the way you think about checks and captures. Very often they are usefully given not for their own sake but because they require responses that change the board and may then create good opportunities for double attacks or other tactical strikes. So when you imagine making a capture, do not just ask whether your opponent can recapture and write off the idea if he can. Imagine what would be possible after your opponent recaptures that might not have been possible before. By the same token, a check that easily can be evaded hardly is worthless for that reason. The point of a check commonly is to force the king to move or to force other responses that eventually might make a fork or other tactic possible. This basic principle, viewing checks and captures as ways of changing the look of the board to create other opportunities, rather than as ends in themselves, is the essence of tactical thinking. Black to move. What is the best move? The queen fork. Introduction. Double attacks by the queen, like all others, have certain repeating characteristics that follow from the value of the piece and the types of moves it can make. Every chess player knows to value the queen because of all the different ways it can move. As students of tactics in general and double attacks in particular, however, we can see the queen's value more precisely. Purely as a matter of geometry, the queen can attack any two squares on the board at the same time. If you put the enemy king on one square and another enemy piece on another square, there is always a third square from which your queen can, in principle, attack them both. In the skeletal diagram to the left, white's queen forks black's king and rook. We say in principle because often the needed square will be unreachable or protected, or the lines from the square to the king and loose piece may be blocked by other pieces. But it is worth reflecting anyway on this feature of the queen's power. It helps explain why the queen surpasses all other pieces as a tactical weapon. As a double attacker it has no peer. The queen's immense usefulness also limits its power in this respect. It generally is too valuable to trade for any other enemy piece on the board. Of course the queen sometimes may be sacrificed to achieve checkmate. You may exchange queens, if the other is more dangerous than yours, and very occasionally you may give up your queen in return for a large number of your opponent's other pieces. But usually it isn't worthwhile to use your queen to take an enemy piece that is protected. Either the protection has to be eliminated or a different, loose target has to be found. Notice the practical implication: usually at least one loose, i.e., unguarded, enemy piece must be found or created for a queen fork to be effective. This principle, the requirement of a loose piece, does not apply to knight forks, because if a knight attacks a rook or queen it makes no difference whether they are defended, you gain just by exchanging, because knights are less valuable than those other pieces. We can go farther. When your queen inflicts a double attack, the enemy will have time to move one of the attacked pieces. If neither of them are his king, he usually will move whichever is unprotected. That means that to be effective a double attack by the queen usually has to attack either two unprotected pieces or an unprotected piece plus the king, for only then will there still be an unprotected piece left behind for your queen to capture after your opponent moves the more valued or vulnerable target of the fork to safety. Attacking the king here has all the advantages that it did when we studied knight forks. The opponent must attend to the threat, usually by moving the king or interposing something, thus leaving the other piece being forked to get taken. An additional possibility we will consider, almost as good as attacking the king, is threatening mate. This less often is an issue for the knight than for the queen, because the knight less easily can make such threats. Here, then, are the key points to guide your hunting. The targets for a double attack by a queen usually include: a. the king either by a check or by a mating threat, and b. an unprotected knight, bishop, or rook. You are looking for squares from which your queen can attack two of those targets, or where it might be able to attack them after some preliminary maneuvers. From this we can deduce a fairly manageable set of challenges to making queen forks work. The forking square is guarded, the line to the forking square is blocked, or the line from the forking square to one of the targets is blocked. The king is not yet in position to be checked, but can be brought into position. There is not yet a loose piece at the other end of the fork, but a piece there can be loosened, or an already loose piece can be forced there by threat or attraction. In the next sections we will study how to identify and solve each of these problems. The solutions to most of them involve exchanges. White to move. What is the best move? Simple cases, forking the king and a loose piece. We start with simple positions where the queen is one move away from inflicting a double attack. Even if you are new to queen forks you may be able to see the solutions to many of these right away. It's still worth studying them methodically so that your grasp of the principles involved will be clear when we move to more complicated cases. For other readers, double attacks with the queen may be hard to spot at first. In the beginning the board will look like a sea of pieces and squares, with the queen coming out of nowhere to attack two targets. But in fact most double attacks with the queen follow recognizable patterns, and these simple positions will enable you to nail down their fundamentals before worrying about how to remove obstacles to their execution. In each position your task is to find a square your queen can reach and from which it will, a. check the enemy king and, b. attack a loose enemy knight, bishop, or rook. So you might begin by finding the undefended enemy pieces on the board. Think of this as a basic and ongoing part of your job during a game. Every loose piece is a potential target you might be able to take for free with a double attack. Next, look at any checks available to your queen. Sometimes this will be easy, but more spectacular double attacks often require you to notice checks possible from counterintuitive squares. It is good to be exhaustive. Think of it this way: the queen can move in both directions on the rank where it sits, on the file where it sits, and on each of the two diagonals where it sits. So it has a maximum of 8 available paths. Be aware of its possible movements along each of them, asking if any squares it can reach would provide it with an open line to the enemy king and whether any of those same squares also provide it with an open line to a loose enemy piece. In practice you can disregard some checks very rapidly, but as you are learning about forks you are better off erring on the side of being thorough. The example to the left is as simple as the pattern gets. Again, you are looking for two things: unprotected, loose, black pieces, and moves by white that check the black king. The idea is to combine those ingredients to create a double attack. Black has one unprotected piece, the knight. White has one way to check the king, queen moves to d8. That move also attacks, and collects, the knight after black spends a move relocating his king to h7. Black to move. What is the best move? First observation: White's rook is unprotected. So is his queen, but it's a harder target to go after. Second observation: in queen moves to d4, Black's queen has a safe check that attacks White's rook. So there is the idea of the fork. But then you also want to make sure White can't wriggle out of it. His natural idea would be to try to move the rook away and block the check all in one move with rook moves to f2. So suppose he does. How do you figure out whether this reply spoils your idea? Ask the cardinal question: consider what your next check would be, and with what consequences. Here its rook moves to a1, which forces White's king to h2. His rook has been left loose, so Black takes it, queen takes rook. White to move. What is the best move? Look for unprotected black pieces and you find the rook at g5. Look for checks White can give with his queen and you find 2, queen moves to d8 and queen takes at g7. Be careful not to overlook a check just because the needed square is occupied by an enemy piece. Queen moves to d8 is the winning move, it checks the king and also attacks, and wins, the rook,